Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Rowley, and I'm with the NOAA Central Library, and we are hosting this for the Weather Program Office. First things first, if you are having any technical difficulties, if you cannot hear the audio, if you are having trouble viewing the slides, please send a chat. But the best thing you can do would be log out and log back in. If you're still having issues, send that chat or email library.brownbag@noaa.gov, and I will try and work that out with you. And we will be accepting questions in this, but they will be answered after the presentation. So we will hold all of those until the presentation is finished. There should be a question panel. You will not be able to see everyone's questions, but we will be reading those out verbally for the presenters to answer. If we do not get to your question, please know that they will be passed on and that you will be answered offline. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gina to give our presenters their introduction.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us for this really exciting webinar. As you may know, the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act of 2017 requires NOAA to prioritize research that improves forecasts and warnings for the protection of life, property, and the enhancement of the national economy. Through measuring the value of resiliency built in the economy via forecast accuracy and mitigation efforts, Dr. Haydar Kurban and his student Jasmine Fuller from Howard University, who are here with us today, are developing a methodology for assessing the value of information generated by weather forecasts, specifically today talking about severe weather events. Haydar and Jasmine, we are so thrilled to have you, and I would love to give you the floor for your wonderful economic presentation here today.
Well, thank you very much. So let me just say a few words before I start. So Jasmine Fuller, she's a Ph.D. student at Howard University, and we got some research funds from NOAA, and the idea was to do projects like this. And she has been really great help, and I'm so happy to have her. This is her first year at Howard, and she has been an excellent researcher. So what we are doing is that she's going to present our results, with our research, and then I'm going to kind of towards the end, I'm going to do the conclusion and other stuff. So based on that, let me Jasmine, so let's go ahead.
Okay, hello, I'm Jasmine, and so I'll just begin our presentation. The title of our presentation is called Measuring the Economic Impact of Preparedness During Severe Weather Events. And like Dr. Kurban said, we've been working on this project this year. Okay, here we go. And then here's our acknowledgement. Okay, so severe weather. So these graphs show trends of severe weather between 1980 to the present. And so in the past decade, there's many studies that have found links between climate change and increases in severe weather. So increases in severe weather frequency, intensity, and duration. And so you could see in these two graphs, both of them kind of begin earlier than 1980, but there is a trend in increasing. One of the graphs talks about a trend in heavy precipitation, and then the other graph talks about wind speed. So there's been a steady increase since the 1980s until now. Oops. Okay, and then some more about that. So severe weather events would be considered like thunderstorms, tornadoes, floods, lightning, all of those different things, and they often occur simultaneously. So an extreme thunderstorm may lead to flooding and fires. So these things don't happen in isolation. And that's kind of an important aspect as well when we're thinking about assigning some type of economic responsibility to these severe weather events. And so all of these severe weather events have been previously and have the potential in the future to be responsible for a lot of significant damages to public and private property. as well as human life and health. Just last year in 2019, there were about 14 severe weather events that that individually caused over $1 billion in damages. So that's kind of a big deal when we talk about when we talk about things like having to rebuild, or talking about insurance, or just some of those other economic properties. And so then here I just have two photos, a car destroyed during a hailstorm, and then a tree knocked over onto a home because of severe winds. So I'm going to begin to talk about kind of the relationship between weather forecasts and preparatory actions. So the quality of weather forecasts have improved greatly in the past decade. And so the knowledge about severe weather events are available days prior to their occurrence, and then even with a lot of these weather trends, we can understand different seasons for certain severe weather events. So we could even know months or possibly like a year in advance when these severe weather events will occur. And so recent studies have shown that actions taken prior to the occurrence of a severe weather event can actually decrease the total negative impacts. So basically, if I'm able to prepare for a storm before it comes, then I'm able to avoid some of the damages from the storm. So some of these preparatory actions, so in the short term, so that would kind of be talking about the weather forecasts that are available days prior to the occurrence. So in the short term, you can evacuate, secure your personal belongings, or begin to stock emergency kits. And then in the long term, so that would be kind of like severe weather trends. So say in certain areas that are more prone to tornadoes or hurricanes. So some long-term actions could be to practice some emergency drills and also purchase some disaster insurance. And so that kind of leads us to our research question. So we intend to estimate the impact of preparatory actions on damages incurred as a result of severe weather. So we are trying to understand these preparatory actions and assign a economic value to them. So if I obtained flood insurance and I'm in an area that's at high risk for floods, in the event of a flood, how much economic, or what is the economic cost of that, whether that obtaining that insurance is a cost savings or a loss based on whether an event occurs and then the damages associated with that particular event. So currently, studies that estimate severe weather damages don't account for these impacts of preparatory actions. So basically, they're trying to predict the impact of certain severe weather events without accounting for the fact that people may have taken some of these preparatory actions. Say if I ended up evacuating from my home, then I wouldn't have incurred maybe some health risk, and I wouldn't have to then have gone to see a doctor and incurred those healthcare costs. So the current damage estimates don't include this aspect. And so down here is from the Nordhaus 2006 paper that talks about severe weather damages, specifically hurricanes. And so this is the damage function that's used there. And we expect that a lot of the coefficients on these variables will be decreased because they'll contribute less towards the damages because of the impact of the preparatory actions. Okay, so how prepared are we for severe weather? So trying to figure out what we have done to prepare and what we plan to do to prepare, and just in general, how prepared is the public. And so we use two different data sources to figure this out. And so the first data source that we use is the FEMA National Household Survey, and that was published in 2018, and it reveals disaster preparedness of individual households. So it was administered by phone in 2018. There was over 5,000 responses nationwide. And so the questions included were open and closed-ended. So they had yeah, and I'll show you the next slide where we have some more example questions. So the one at the bottom is, has your household developed and discussed an emergency plan that includes instructions and those different things? And they also have questions that ask you more about, do you feel as though that you're prepared? Has your experience with disasters in the past contributed to your preparedness, and just different things like that. So they not only ask concrete preparedness questions, they also ask about sentiments towards preparedness and towards severe weather events. And so I have some of these questions in the next slide. So I can just give everyone a minute to kind of look and read through. And then I'll move on to the next slide. And these show more of the sentiment questions, like what motivated you to take these steps to become better prepared, or yeah, some of these other ones, like in the past, have you practiced what to do in a disaster? Just things like that. Okay. And then I'll move to the next slide. So the other data set we use is published by the U.S. Census Bureau and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it's the American Housing Survey, and it was published this year, but it was administered in 2017. And oh, and I forgot to say that the National Household Survey, the survey that I talked about previously, that one is published yearly, where this one has gaps in its in the survey administration. So the last survey was in 2013, and then the most recent one was administered in 2017. And so this was also administered by phone and has a larger data set with over 65,000 responses. But this survey specifically targeted larger metropolitan areas. So they would target areas like Chicago, or just bigger cities like New York City, those types of things, where the National Household Survey was kind of more focused on trying to find a population that represents the United States as a whole. And I'll talk about some of those differences a little bit later between the two data sets. And so I have some example questions from this survey as well, which doesn't ask as detailed questions as the National Household Survey, nor does it ask any sentiment questions. So I'll just give you guys a minute to look through this slide as well. And then I'll move to the next slide. Okay, and so yeah, so in this slide, I'm going to begin to talk about the differences between the two data sets. So like I mentioned before, yeah, so the National Household Survey and the American Housing Survey, they ask very similar questions about preparedness. Like they both have questions about whether you have an emergency drill, or if you have, or whether you have a, I'm sorry, yeah, sorry, and also whether you have disaster insurance, just different things like that, whether you have a, like finances set up in case of an emergency, just those types of things. So they ask very similar questions. But the American Housing Survey, like I mentioned, is very focused on metropolitan areas, and the National Household Survey uses urban and rural responses from urban and rural populations to mimic the national geographic population distribution. And the National Household Survey inquires about non-physical preparatory action. So like I said before, it's more sentimental. It asks you how you feel about being prepared. Why do you prepare? Just different questions like that. So that could be really helpful in understanding maybe how we can improve someone's preparedness, and maybe better ways to advertise preparedness actions to people, or in general, just a better way to give out the information, knowing how people feel personally about severe weather events themselves and making preparations for them. And so some more differences between the two is that the National Household Survey asks a lot of more detailed questions about preparedness, just because not only are they, the survey is just about that in general. So the point of the survey is to understand disaster preparedness. So they have a lot more questions, and they're a lot more detailed. And the American Housing Survey, because it's about housing in general, it's just one section about disaster preparedness. And so it doesn't have as much detailed questions, because the survey asks different things about home improvement and mortgage rates, and just home conditions and general housing questions that are not necessarily relevant to this project. They both also have similar demographic information, which is really helpful as well. So they both ask similar demographic questions, so we can understand more than just a regional breakdown of the differences in preparedness, but also throughout different populations. And so another thing about the National Household Survey is it doesn't have any like cost or economic data relating to severe weather damages, but the American Housing Survey does include damage repair costs. So basically it has figures about the cost people incurred from severe weather damages, not the cost that they incurred, but the cost they incurred to repair damages from severe weather. So that's really helpful in trying to understand, in our project, in trying to understand the economic value of preparedness. And then finally, the American Housing Survey includes a lot of questions about preparedness, different preparatory actions that are more advanced, let's say, than in the National Household Survey. For example, they ask if households have access or have installed generators or tornado shelters. So those are kind of indicate higher levels of preparedness, and the National Household Survey doesn't ask questions like that. It more asks very basic preparedness questions about whether you have an emergency plan, or if you have, like the finances set aside, those different things. And so the American Housing Survey kind of takes it to the next level to kind of understand a higher level of preparedness, I guess. And so in this project, we do focus on the data using the American Housing Survey. So even though we do have both the data sets available, the American Housing Survey was more relevant to what we were doing in our project, and it was kind of easier to format the data with the preparedness data and compare it to the cost very directly. Going throughout the project, that is the data set that we have used. In the future, we may be able to incorporate the National Household Survey as well, but the American Housing Survey will be what we use in the rest of this presentation. Okay, so so bringing it back to the weather forecast and the preparatory action. So one of the really interesting things we found in our data set is that TV news is the most popular source of severe weather preparation advice. So normally the place where people get their information about severe weather events is also where they get their advice about how to prepare for these events. So that's really interesting, the influence that TV news has on preparatory actions. And so, yeah, so I said advice is typically presented to the public following the broadcast. And so the FEMA 2018 survey and the American Housing Survey both show that TV news is the most popular place to get information about preparatory actions. And so here I have a graph from the American Housing Survey that shows the two highest number of the two highest sources of disaster information are television and the internet. And then here is a graph from so here's a graph from the National Household Survey that shows all the way at the end that it's very large. TV news has very much a larger influence than any of the other sources of disaster information. And so this is specifically for hurricane disaster information. Like I mentioned before, the National Household Survey is a lot more detailed. So they kind of break down each type of severe weather in separate categories to ask this question, but in all of them, it shows that TV news is by far the largest source of that information. So I thought that was an interesting summary of the data. And so moving on to the next slide. Okay, so now, like I said, I'm going to go into just specifically the American Housing Survey data. So to figure out how prepared we are for severe weather. And so let's start at the table. So here in this table, I show the different questions, all of the questions asked in the American Housing Survey, and then the percentage of respondents that answered yes to the question and the percentage of respondents that answered no. So some of the largest, so a lot of these questions are pretty largely responded to. So if they have 3 days of non-perishable food, so 82% said yes. And so this is nationwide data, so across the entire data set. And then even for flood insurance, we have 88% said yes to flood insurance. And then if they had an evacuation vehicle available, 92%, and then evacuation funds up to $2,000, 77% said yes. And so it seemed as though, you know, everyone was pretty prepared. Nothing was alarmingly low in the responses, minus the generator, whether or not they had a generator present or a tornado safe room. But like I said before, those are kind of indicators of very high levels of disaster preparedness. And then moving on to the graph, it shows that only about 20% of respondents were not prepared and most were prepared. So the definition of prepared and not prepared were based on the positive responses to these survey questions. So I considered prepared to be, and this was kind of just a raw manipulation of the data. So I considered prepared to be having answered yes to more than 6 of these, to more than 6 of these preparedness questions. So meaning that maybe I had a generator, had 3 days of non-perishable food, 3 days of water supply. So those different types of things. So if I answered yes to 6 or more of those, then I am considered prepared. And if I answered yes to less than 6 of those, then I'm considered not prepared. So for this, it shows that close to 80% of the respondents answered yes to more than 6 or more of these preparedness questions. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. And then moving on to the next slide. So another interesting table or interesting summary of statistics that we looked at was specifically the question if did the respondent have access to financial resources, either cash or savings, or available credit card balances that would meet expenses up to $2,000. And so we broke this survey responses down by race. And so it was really interesting here. All of them have higher positive queries to this, or positive responses to this query than negative. And so here we have some of the highest response races would be Asian and white, and like amongst the lowest would be Black and Alaskan Native and American Indian. And so I thought that was an interesting thing to look at as well. Okay, and so here we have the survey responses to the highly prepared queries. So this is broken down by metropolitan region, and so that's what we continue to do in our analysis. So we take so we take all this data and kind of separate it by these metropolitan regions, just to kind of understand what areas are more prepared than others, because these different regions do experience different levels of or different amounts of severe weather events. So we just kind of thought it was interesting to try to figure out that relationship. And so here I have it broken down into whether they answered yes or no to questions, whether they have a generator present, or tornado safe room, or flood insurance. And there wasn't a lot of, there wasn't a lot of data, or there wasn't a lot of responses relating to the tornado safe room, but in terms of having a generator present, it looked like the higher responding places that had a generator present were places like Miami and places like Miami, and Houston, and even New York had a high response rate on that one. And then in terms of flood insurance, everyone was pretty much around the same amount, but you did have kind of larger outliers like Miami again, and some of these other different places. Okay, and then, here's the rest of the regions. So I kind of had to separate them into two slides to make it easier to see. And so here we have, again, some of the higher places, the places that answer that they have a generator present, like Detroit and Seattle, and then other places with the flood insurance. These are pretty much similar figures here. So I thought that was interesting as well. Okay, so now I'm going to try to just like summarize everything that we've found. So to answer like who is more prepared for severe weather. In our preliminary research with the first data set, the National Household Survey, we did find that Florida, Texas, and California were amongst the more prepared places, just using the idea that those were the places that answered positively to most of the survey queries. So they had the most yes responses to whether or not they were prepared. And so same with the American Housing Survey. So they agreed more specifically, I think it was Miami, Houston, and Riverside, California, in terms of, because they measured in metropolitan areas, like I said before. So those were amongst the most prepared areas. So they had answered yes to most of the queries about preparedness. And so also another interesting thing is that Florida, Texas, and California residents are also the ones that experience the most disasters based on the American Housing Survey responses. So they ask in the survey whether or not they have experienced a disaster, and if so, what type of disaster have they experienced. And these respondents seem to kind of match up. So the ones that were most prepared were also the ones that experienced the most disasters, which is also an interesting idea as well. Okay, so moving on to trying to evaluate our research questions. So we are going to use the disaster repair cost data that I talked about having access to from the American Housing Survey, and then comparing them to regions that were most prepared for disasters, and then against regions that were the least prepared for disasters, to kind of see whether there was a trend in low repair costs associated with regions more prepared than those that were less prepared. And so here we have some of the data tables as well that show, these all show the disaster repair cost separated by severe weather events. So the earthquake disaster repair cost separated by metropolitan region, tornado and hurricane, landslide, all of those. And so it shows the different cost amounts, and that is the data we use to employ our regression results that we'll talk about later as well. And then here in the next slide, we have the fire disaster repair cost, the flood disaster repair cost, and then other disaster repair costs. And so these figures not only are very variant within this specific disaster, but also are pretty variant across disasters, which is also interesting. And so I think now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kurban so he could talk about the regression analysis and talk about some of our results and conclusions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jasmine. This was a great presentation. So, having working with a good student, right? It's it really makes a difference. So what we have done so far is that we try to kind of do the exploratory analysis to see this data to questions, and because we are really kind of looking at the relationship between the preparedness and the cost of the repair cost that people are facing. So the literature so far, they have used the data from NOAA and other places that you have the impact data or the disaster data just by regions, by the impact area. Here we think that having access to individual level, household level information about how much they pay for the repairs that directly resulted from the severe weather events is important, because these are the cost, economic costs that we're talking, repair costs talking about, is that these are the costs that the people experienced, they incurred, either paid by the insurance or by them. So this is kind of a total cost. So what we did is that we are still in exploratory kind of stage. We're trying to find this models playing the variables to see that what might explain if we have good indicators of preparedness that might related to that might mitigate or reduce the repair cost of the weather events. So the first column of this regression here we have is that first we just regressed the household level repair cost on the this would be on the prices and other things. So here we have is the total cost. I haven't, we're not presenting the results for significant each event. Here will be the total. So here what we have is that of course the prices that houses prices are higher, and their repair cost, the damage cost, is going to be higher. So the value, the coefficient on the market price of the house is positive. And then what we do in the first column, we are estimating this model that we have the dependent variable is the repair cost, and independent variables are the market price of the house that people live in it. And then we have the dummy variables for the regions. Here we have 15 metropolitan areas, and it's so this shows the variations in the repair cost after controlling for the market price of the house. And it shows that, of course, the places that the house value is higher, the relationship is positive. There are three places that kind of coming out of here. We have that are significant. So we have this Dallas, Miami, and I think Houston. There's three places that they are their repair costs are significantly different than the other. Here the control group is the other metropolitan areas that were not part of the 15 ones. These are small places. So that's the comparison. In the model 2, we introduce flood insurance to see that if our coefficients was happening, kind of changing or not. So so the flood insurance coefficient is positive. Of course, it's expected because flooding. Again, this also goes with the house prices and income, right? So people that own expensive houses, right, they're also gonna pay more for the flood insurance. So our coefficients are kind of, we just see that if any coefficient is kind of moving or not stable. So then in the model 3, here we have, now we include the generator, whether the households are generated. Now here, having a positive coefficient on generator is not surprising, because when Jasmine presented the averages across the states, we noticed that in the high income states, people tend to have more generator, especially in New York and other places. So this kind of picking up that that relationship. And then, so now we're gonna introduce evacuation kits, right? Whether people have evacuation kits or not. And here, the result is not significant, but not the bigger number, but it is interesting, because here it seems like having evacuation kits, right, so the people that are having evacuation kits, it seems like this might be kind of a variable that's correlated with their preparedness in other respects, right? Somehow they might be more prepared, right, that reduce their damage cost after we control for relevant variables. In the model 5, we introduce household income. And because household income is also important, right? People have different incomes, so we see that if the coefficients are the same, so the coefficient of the evacuation kits and others are kind of not changing much. So this is our kind of first regression that we looked at, the cost that incurred, the repair costs incurred due to all the hazards, the weather events. We are not presenting, the results for single weather events, because really you want to kind of get feedback from here, and because we are still searching for right models. But I did, run those models on different events, and the patterns are kind of similar, but this is kind of something that is future work. So these regressions are, so the idea here is that to see the relationship between the preparedness and the repair cost, and to see that if any of those measures might be kind of measuring or correlated with people's behaviors that that might be well prepared, and that in return might also reduce the repair costs. So this is basically that. Next one. Okay. So this project, there's one important aspect of this project is that we have access to household level repair cost data. This is, I think, is a very interesting, because previous researchers, we haven't seen much research that have used this data. So this is interesting because it allows us to see the repair cost, right, across the geographies, across different demographic groups. So we know, and as a result, we're incorporating preparedness into the economic impact analysis that is not done in the research so far. The research that is done on economic impact of analysis of the weather events. And we are searching a channel through which that these actions might reduce the economic cost of the severe weather events. Now, some of them are not related to economic impacts, right? Some of them are just for safety and save of the life savings, other things that maybe it requires a different dependent variable. But we feel like we have a good data set and we can kind of expand in many directions. So this data set also provides new research resources in risk communication research, because in the risk communication research, having the impact of the weather events or forecasts or preparedness, right, how they affect the local areas and how people take measures, and as a result, how it affects the economic impacts of these severe events is something that has not been resolved easily because of this complexity. So I think this is in that way it contributes to the National Weather Act too, because of this. I think it's going to be, it might be a good contribution to risk communication research. Next one. So the basic take on here is that, so we show that there is a significant variation in economic cost of as measured by repair cost across the areas, across the different areas, across demographics. Some of those variations are because some regions, they have more exposure, but some of it can be attributed to the variation in preparedness. And this is our focus. It's so far among the preparedness measures, it seems like eviction kits are something that might have a negative impact, but we have to do more research, do more estimates on that. Among the regions, Miami, it seems like has less repair cost, and Dallas and Houston have more repair costs. These are the places that kind of stick out, kind of shows in terms of the variations. So next one. So next step. So now so far we have used very little of FEMA's National Household Survey, and we use American Housing Survey. And we think that the questions that in National Household Survey about the sentiments is very interesting, because that might also help us to understand the linkage, right? How people get this weather forecast and how they kind of act on it. That void can be filled with that data set. The downside of the National Household Survey is that it does not have information about repair costs or economic cost of the severe weather events. So we have a sheltered data. This data set is basically looks at each severe weather events, and it kind of collects, aggregates the cost by the impact area. So it will be interesting to kind of aggregate some of our data in the places that we have severe weather events to kind of compare the totals. I think it's going to be very interesting. So we will have investigate specific survey questions, like again about how household take the information, how they acted, and when and do they act on it, why they acted, why they don't act it, and to kind of look at those variations, try to explain the degrees of preparedness. This is basically, I'm going to stop here. I think I'm behind my time. Thank you. And questions, and the next one is, if you want to have further questions, please reach us through our email addresses.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Kurban and Jasmine. Yeah. We do have some questions. Okay. So I'm going to start off with the first one from Roy Thun. He's curious as to why your long-term actions did not include improvements to structures above current building codes as FEMA recommends.
Okay, that's a great question, and that's true. The building codes are very important. This is just, what we haven't, so the idea is that, can we look at the variations in the building codes across the places and create an indicator variable for that? And some places have changed. Yes, that might be very interesting. Yes, yeah, definitely we'll include that. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is Ross Stickman. Is social media included in the TV news category?
Jasmine?
No, social media is not included in the National Household Survey TV news question. So that has a separate, category, and it's all the way at the end, and it's one of the lower ones. Whereas the American Housing Survey, that one, the internet does include social media as well. So they kind of differ on their idea of the effect of social media, but both of them agree on the TV news aspect of it.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Caitlin Simpson. Did the American Household Survey include respondents in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands?
I think she means American Housing Survey, right?
Yes.
Not the National Household Survey. Yeah, okay. So that is basically it covers large metropolitan areas. So here we have 15 metropolitan areas. In the past, they might have, I'm not sure about that. If they did Puerto Rico, I'm not sure about that, but I can look at it. But right now, because of the privacy issues and data issues, it's very hard to find, to identify the locations that are smaller. So even if they do it right, you cannot see that because they don't reveal the information. Jasmine presented some of their tables because we get it from American Housing Survey table creator, which is very nice. You can do that. And then by using the administrative data, again, whenever the geography is too small, they don't reveal the data because of the privacy issues. So it is not, Puerto Rico is not among those, their current list of the urban areas. In the past, they might have done it. I don't know. I can check on it.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Joseph Conran. For the regression, would it make sense to tie the geographic variables to average rainfall if you're including flood insurance as a predictor?
True, correct, yes, because of that would be the measure of not the because this is the all events, right? When we estimate the regression separately for each severe weather events, we have 6 of them, right? That the data is available. We would be planning to kind of get a measure for that, like what the type of the amount, the number of the severe weather events that they have. But we haven't collected that data. But because we haven't, I mean, of course, the binary variable on the geographies, on the urban areas might pick up some of those effects, yes.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Chris Lauer. What explains the significant coefficients for certain cities but not others?
These are correlations, right? It means that they are different. So Miami and other places, things might be that these places, they have maybe more serious weather events, and there might be more emphasis. There was a big events that might have, make, kind of help the population to move for preparedness actions or the governments to do that. A good example is that, like in New York, because of power outages, the people have more generator that in New York than before. But we have to separate those impacts. We haven't done it because just right now we have one variable that gets a lot of actions different ways. So this is again a very good question. That's something that we have to kind of look at the history of those places. Maybe there is something that is specific about that. Is it helps people to, or leads people to act differently than other places.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Rajendra Purell. Does this research utilize impact analysis for planning as it relates to impacts in U.S. economy?
That is the plan. The plan is to have stable coefficients, right? Robust results that shows which measures are somehow, because of the correlation, other thing, they have effect on the economic impact. Once we obtain those coefficients, it will be easy to estimate the contribution of those measures. Now, the impact of the weather forecast, that is a little bit hazy here because this preparatory actions, some of it is because people have the forecast and they act on it. Some of it is just depends on how the local areas are organized, how the information is is dispersed, and so on and so forth. So if we get a good coefficient, it's a robust coefficient that we have a lot of checks on it, and that coefficient will be very easy to put a dollar amount on it in terms of the economic value of these strategies, these measures.
Great, thank you. Next question is from David Hawk. On the regression slide, can you explain a little more? Are the values dollars compared to control case? And why are some positive and some negative?
So the controls are small areas in the urban areas, right? So these are the places that, because American Housing Survey, they survey the city, the central city population and the suburbs. So there might, and the definition of the urban area as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau is any place that is have more than 50,000 population. So the places that were not part of this big 15 big metropolitan areas, there are a lot of them. The population is pretty big. They're a very important part of the sample. So basically, we are comparing these big cities to the smaller areas. So compared to those smaller areas, some places are more, some are less. So that's where the negative and positive is coming.
Are those values dollars though?
Yes, because it says for a city, right? It has yes, it's dollars. I mean, it's like very crude. It's very crude now, right? I don't want to put any. Yeah.
Great,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Our next question. The R squared values are less than 7% and variables are significant in at least 5% level. What makes the R squared low?
This is a typical problem with the cross-section data, right? I mean, the R squares are small because this is it's not the correlations are not that strong, right? Of the explanatory variables between that correlations between explanatory variables and the dependent variables are not. This is a typical problem that you usually have with the cross-section data.
Great. Our next question. There could be an endogenous relationship between your dependent variable and several of your explanatory variables. Did you test for endogeneity in this model?
That's true. There could be, and we haven't, because this is just, we have been just working on this. We got at the hand of the data in last 1 month or 2 months, kind of the whole thing. Yes, and we will test for the reverse causality. Yeah, I haven't done it, but yes, he's right. The question, whoever is asking the question is, who's asking the question? I'm sorry.
That was Chris Lauer.
Okay, Chris. Yeah, he's right. Yeah, we will do that. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. The generator coefficient is positive while evacuation kit coefficient is negative. How can this be interpreted?
Well, it's early, right? I mean, the generator probably this is related to people. It might be some kind of socio-economic factors. I mean, I said income or wealth. Eviction is not correlated with that, right? Something that some people just eviction doesn't cost them a lot to buy it. So I think that's why we were very excited about that variable because of this, the loose bound, the relation between that and the income or wealth and other factors. Because it's not big, right? I mean, anyone can do that. It's not just, it doesn't cost much to do it.
Great, thank you. And I think a last question is, did doing this work cause you yourself to change or increase your own personal disaster preparedness?
Intentions, yes, but did I act on it? I don't know. Jasmine, did you act on it?
No, it definitely made me think about it. Like when they asked people about emergency plans, I was like, oh, I don't have one of those, but I still don't have one.
Yeah. But the one more thing, like if I add, is that because I haven't seen these data sets are new, and that's why we're excited a lot about that. I think they're also important because you have this economic data about the repair cost, which is they're very solid, variables. Has anyone done any study on this 2 data sets? If they can send us, that'd be very great, so that we don't want to reinvent the wheel.
Wonderful. Well, that is the end of our questions. But if anyone does have further questions, you can see Dr. Kurban's and Jasmine's emails on the screen here, and send those on there. This has been recorded. It will be up on the library's YouTube channel. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful day and you're all staying safe and healthy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you.